This is Professor Mikkel Rasmussen. He comes from Denmark. He teaches something which is a bit indistinct, like politics of art, politics of aesthetics, aesthetics of politics.
Political aesthetics.
Political aesthetics.
That's what they call it.
The normal University of Copenhagen. He wrote his, as you see, but he wrote already many books. I think he's a compulsive writer. And among all these books, a book on Trump's counter-revolution he spoke about last Friday at this very place, and today a book, a very fascinating book on the notion of avant-garde in the West, of course, in arts and politics. Because what's interesting in the notion of avant-garde is that for us in the West, it immediately connects art and politics. So I imagine this is what he will talk about. He's a specialist of one of the last avant-garde movements in the US and Europe, which is situationism. He will talk about it tomorrow in Taipei at the National University for Arts. So maybe I imagine today to mention that. So, okay, let's
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for attending, thanks for showing up and discussing the topic of the avant-garde with me. I've written a presentation, a lecture, and have made a small PowerPoint presentation as well with some photos, illustrations, and the most important quotes. And this is a continuation of a longer project that has to do with the avant-garde. The avant-garde, precisely as Hans just said, as both an artistic but also a political endeavor or gesture, and how the artistic avant-garde or the anti-artistic avant-garde, how they have been placed within the arts, within visual arts, where the question of political engagement, political commitment has been most striking. And today I'll try and discuss kind of like the status of the avant-garde, whether it still makes sense to talk about the avant-garde, hence the title, the avant-garde, after the end of modernism, after the end of the working class movement in the West. And as you'll see, I guess you can say it's the avant-garde. It's a paradoxical phenomenon. So the presentation is, I don't know if it's with paradoxes, puzzles, but it tends to have a what we perhaps can call a dialectical development. I could start by saying that the avant-garde is dead and has been for a while, but that would probably be a little too stridently. Perhaps it's better to say that the avant-garde is in crisis, or perhaps that the avant-garde is not there. But no matter how I phrase it, it sounds a bit banal. It's a diagnosis we've heard quite often, and we have all the accusations and all the defenses in stock. Perhaps it's necessary instead to begin by posing the question, why talk about the avant-garde at all today? Can we take anybody serious who talks about the avant-garde seriously? It might come off as a cheap trick, but the following sentence should do the trick. Not that the discussion is over, but it's a way to start the analysis. Quote goes something like this in the English translation. Futurism also undoubtedly represents an offshoot of the old literature. But Russian futurism did not reach its full development under the old literature. When the war and revolution began, futurism was still bohemian, which is a normal condition for every new literary school in capitalist cities. Under the impulse of events, futurism directed its development into the new channels of the revolution. It would be extremely frightening to establish by analogies and comparisons the identity of futurism and communism, and so form the deduction that futurism is the art of the proletariat. Such pretensions must be rejected. But this does not signify a contemptuous attitude towards the work of the futurists. In our opinion, they are the necessary links in the forming of a new and great literature. End of quote. Fascinating reading. It's Trotsky in July 1924. That is one of the most important figures in the Russian Revolution. A lead character in the most important event in the 20th century. Trotsky organized a decisive insurrection that led to the Bolshevik state coup in 1917. Later he was found on command of the Red Army against the counter-revolution, against the Whites, and against invading forces from Great Britain, France, etc. At the time Trotsky wrote the text, which I quoted from, in 1924, after the end of the Civil War, in a few months after Lenin's death, Trotsky was busy fighting Stalin and his troika, composed of, among others, Zioniev and Kamenev, who were busy bureaucratizing the Bolshevik party and introducing a secretarial hierarchy. Stalin was busy nationalizing the revolution with his idea of socialism in one country. Trotsky disagreed and argued in favor of the necessity of a world revolution, without which the revolution in Russia would never succeed. Only a series of successful revolutions in highly developed countries would make it possible to shatter capitalism. Despite his many doings and tasks, Trotsky took his time writing about art and the avant-garde at this moment. The quote is interesting because it shows the significance the question of art and culture, the question of the avant-garde, had in the Russian Revolution, and for one of the most important actors in the Russian Revolution. It shows that art was endowed with an enormous potential, that art was directly involved in the construction of a new world. Trotsky is talking about Russian futurism, and it's quite spectacular what he says. Trotsky doesn't equate communism and futurism, but the mere suggestion of such an equation says a lot about the significance of the avant-garde, about the role of the avant-garde in the construction of a new life after the Russian Revolution. It's a long time ago. It can be quite tiresome to once more return to the question of the avant-garde and again juxtapose the historical avant-garde movements with later and contemporary artistic practices. For the 125th time asked question, what was the avant-garde and where is it? How many or how few avant-gardist gestures are still present today? Is contemporary art irrelevant without the avant-garde's radical challenge of the institution? Was the avant-garde's confrontative rampage against the conventions of bourgeois society and norms naive? And are we therefore luckily, and have they therefore luckily been replaced by more subtle aesthetic expansions later? Is contemporary art nothing but an appendix to the culturalized neoliberal economy? Was the avant-garde already nothing but a test and development unit for the capitalist market, was always ready to take on the loud transgressions of the avant-garde? These are some of the questions. I continue to believe that the avant-garde remains one of the best entries to the question of the possible critical potential of art in a capitalist society. the Trotsky quote shows that this was once the case, that the avant-garde was very important, that the avant-garde was related to the question of revolution and the question of a communist revolution, that they somehow went together. It might be forcing it a bit and reversing the logic in Trotsky's argument, but we could say that without an avant-garde, there's no radical critique. The avant-garde was the place where modern art was true to its dissident perspective, and therefore willing to put it all at stake in the attempt to abolish capitalism. Capitalism, the great enemy of the avant-garde. The avant-garde was an attempt to not only inhabit the intense and overwhelming dissolution of all handed-down relationships, but also critique the temporary re-territorializations of capital, like the nation-state, institutions, and all the different authorities, the family, etc. All the temporary re-territorializations that all in the last instance maintain and reproduce the capitalist society and the capital-labor relation. The avant-garde was an attempt to create a different world beyond capitalism, the inevitable liquidation of the world of privation in all its forms as the Situationist wrote. Art as an event, as a revolutionary break, an attempt to escape the internal oscillation between reactionary paranoid overloads and subterranean schizophrenic revolutionary existence, with the words of Deleuze and Husserl. The alliance and collaboration between the avant-garde and communism was natural at the time. The Trotsky quote testifies to that. A time where communism, or the revolution, was not identified with state capitalism, party bureaucracy, and camps, as was the case in the Soviet Union from the beginning of the 1930s. A moment when communism meant the attempt to loosen human needs from any kind of determinism. That's what Marx talked about as a higher form of socialism, where people can live without money and a program. The avant-garde as an attempt to be affirmative towards the new life, to be affirmative towards the new life, to be affirmative to capitalism as a deluge that both liberates and captures, but an affirmation that qualifies the new life beyond capitalism's forms of dominance. Not to be content with the deluge of capitalism, where all previous notions and socialities lose their meaning, but an attempt to find or create a meaning in capital's extreme destruction of meaning. An attack on the new order, the order or rather disorder of capitalism, where profit and deficit are joined in an open-ended process without meaning beyond the invisible hand of the market. A romantic anti-capitalist endeavor that frames modern art's revolutionary critique of modern bourgeois capitalist society. In a certain sense, these two slides can function as kind of like the complicated dialectic of the whole presentation, but also the question of the legacy of the avant-garde. On one side, we see a painting / commercial by Salvador Dali, great surrealist painter, painted a painting that's used as an advertisement or promotion for a car. And on the other hand, to the other side, we can see members of this small post-avant-gardist Avant-Garde, the Situationist International, intervening in the everyday life in the city, trying somehow to expose a hidden dimension in everyday life, trying somehow to continue the barricade building from May '68 by having created a replica of a statue of Charles Fourier, the utopian socialist, and reinstalling it at Place Clichy in Paris. But wait a minute. I'm getting carried away. The Trotsky quote got the better of me. The best thing we can do would probably be to take Peter Bürger, the German literary historian's historization of the avant-garde, to take his analysis seriously. I mean, the Trotsky quote is pretty old. As Bürger wrote in 1974, it's a historical fact that the avant-garde movements did not put an end to the production of works of art, and that the institution that is art proved resistant to the avant-gardist attack. The revival of art as an institution and the revival of the category work suggest that today the avant-garde is already historical. In other words, that the avant-garde is dead. And this is probably, at least among one of the most important kind of like attempts to develop a coherent theory about the avant-garde. In his book, Peter Bürger tries to distinguish between what he talks about as modernism on the one hand, and then the avant-garde. And the avant-garde is this more radical aspect of modernism, where artists somehow try to set free the potential of art outside in everyday life by critiquing or attacking the art institution, or by giving art a function in everyday life. And Bürger's analysis is, of course, primarily analysis of Dada, the surrealist movement, and the different Russian avant-gardes active after the Russian Revolution. So what we talk about is the interwar avant-garde movements. In a specific historical period, artists tried full-scale Hegel, negate and restore on a higher plane. In a specific historical period, artists tried to sublate the modernist art ideology by scandalizing not only the institution of art, but also the norms of bourgeois capitalist society, giving art a function in a transformed communist everyday life. In theory of the avant-garde, Theorie d'Avant-Garde, Bürger concludes that the project did not succeed, that the heroic wager of the interwar avant-gardes was replaced by the neo-avant-garde's partial repetition after the Second World War, where Dada and surrealism was transformed into artistic styles within the institution of art. For Bürger, the avant-garde was a historical phenomenon with an emphasis on historical in the sense of being past. A historical phenomenon that emerged and disappeared in the time frame of the revolutionary era of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Bürger made the avant-garde into a heroic historical project that occurred between the world wars and was partially reproduced by the so-called new avant-gardes when when the art institution became American after 1954, 1945. We can now expand Bürger's somewhat reduced art historical or reduced art internal analysis and say that the project of the avant-garde was realized upside down as the inclusion of art in the booming post-war modernization, where culture and the production of symbols played a significant role in the new accumulation regime, the forced accumulation regime. That is the story of the movement from a revolutionary anti-artistic project to a simulacrum of the same, from an all-out attack on the art institution through a petit bourgeois to institutional accept and integration, from self-critical investigations of the revolutionary takeoff outside the institution to commercial aesthetics. In other words, a history of decline where almost all point to letting go of the notion of the avant-garde. End of story. Guy Debord and Gianfranco Sanguinetti, the last two remaining members of the Situationist International, They dissolved the group in 1972 and wrote, "Avant-gardes have only one time, and the best thing that can happen to them is, in the full sense of the term, to have had their day." They wrote that in 1972 in the book The Real Split in the International, with which they dissolved their group. Bürger's small book on the avant-garde, Theorie de l'Avant-Garde, appeared just 2 years later, in 1974. The year before, 1973, Manfredo Tefuri, the Italian architectural historian, published his book, Architecture and Utopia, that contained a radical critique of the development of the avant-garde. According to Tefuri, the anti-artistic innovations of the avant-garde were already at the outset allied to capitalist modernization and its restructuring of social life. The avant-garde had thus not really been recuperated, according to Tefuri. I quote, "The entire cycle of modern architecture and the new systems of visual communication came into being, developed, and entered into crisis as an enormous attempt, the last to be made by the great bourgeois artistic culture, an enormous attempt to resolve on the always more outdated level of ideology the imbalances, contradictions, and retardations characteristic of the capitalist reorganization of the world market productive development." Taking stock of Debord, Tefuri, and Bürger's analysis, the lesson seems to be that in the beginning of the 70s, following the dissolution and recuperation of May '68, the avant-garde finally disappeared, or was pronounced to have already disappeared in the late 1930s or some time after. We are left with the avant-garde as a period description, confronted with the so-called politics of contemporary art, where art historians and art critics, without a shred of irony, write about the most applause-seeking, institutionally sanctioned contemporary art. As avant-garde, this is perhaps not that bad. The avant-garde is dead. Get to terms with it. But then again, on the other hand, if we release art from the burden of the avant-garde, from the perspective of the avant-garde, we are no doubt downgrading art to such an extent that it risks fusing with its autonomy as a retracted gesture, functioning hand in glove with the ever more intense impoverishment of human imagination. That is, autonomy and its dissolution into the spectacle as two apparently opposed movements that both confirm the alienation of capitalist society. Autonomy as a legitimation of the transformation of art to a mere commodity and entertainment. A farewell to the avant-garde and critique in favor of an acceptance of the expropriation of language, the very communicative and linguistic being of humans, as Giorgio Agamben puts it, echoing Debord, where there's nothing left, least of all meaning in any radical sense. The 24/7 bombardment of images, representations, brands, and slogans as an emptying out of our communicative capabilities. Abstraction and specialization, as Debord and the Situationist said, referencing Marx and Lukács. In other words, if art is not an attempt to re-enchant, it's nothing. Re-enchant and overthrow. That was the project. As the realist put it in 1925, this is not the quote. We believe in the inevitability of a complete emancipation. So on the one hand, this is the quote from the surrealist, and then on the other hand, 80 years later, we can read the following in Guy de Monteur's book, The Art Firm, Aesthetic Management and Metaphysical Marketing. And it's not ironic, mind you. Who was this Schiller, who sounds like a clever management consultant? This is modern art with McKinsey. Not just art as part of an expanded economy, but economic production and management as art. This is the dream of all. This is the dream of all production as the production of brands. The contrast is enormous. The avant-garde has completely disappeared. But that's the point. Without avant-garde, we're left with art as a phenomenon that at best is a privately interesting dimension of capitalist Euro-modernity's division of life into separate spheres, and in the worst case is a research and development unit in the subsumption of ever more spheres of human life under the spell of the commodities. Art as a break or refusal will in that case be gone for good, as will the ability to analyze and intervene into the global social process. No, I'm sure the avant-garde remains the best starting point for any discussion of the critical potential of art today, for good and bad. But it seems as if we are going in circles here. Perhaps we should try and get a sense of the context in which we're discussing the question of the avant-garde. We are moving into a new epoch. The financial crisis is the beginning of the end of the neoliberal period, which started in the 1970s and was fully implemented in the 1980s, more or less all over the world. The events in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria and Bahrain, Spain, Greece, Chile, Canada, Brazil, Ukraine, Bosnia, France, etc., all the uprisings, all point toward and raise the question of a global revolution, or at least point to the recomposition of capital. These are the conditions and events we need to analyze. This is the conjuncture in which we are situated and in which we have to think the avant-garde. The disappearance or continued relevance of the avant-garde. The current economic crisis started back in the early 1970s when the explosive economic progress of the post-war years, in the guise of the different state-led modernization projects, began to idle and run out of steam. In the longer historical perspective, the neoliberal epoch now appears to be one long crash landing after the explosive economic development of the post-war period, and the epoch since the early 1970s has been characterized by repeated crises. Since the beginning of the 70s, capitalism has tried to reconstruct itself by saving on social reproduction through debt, technological development, and outsourcing of production. Capital has depended more and more on cheap labor from Asia and Eastern Europe, all the while closing down the big industries in places like the Midlands in England and outside Paris. The workers who had protested and rebelled in the late 1960s and early 1970s had to be dispersed and driven out of the cities. To a great extent, the mission was successful, but the financial crisis in 2008 made the debt-based reconstruction dimension of neoliberal capitalism obvious. Paradoxically, the crisis was handled with more of the same, as governments confirmed the status quo by taking over the debt of the banks and the financial sector, whereby finance capital consolidated its power and made it possible for the 1% to amass even more wealth. The 40-year-long erosion of social reproduction thus continues, an erosion not entirely unlike the massive destruction that occurred in the period from 1940 to 1945, when 2 world wars and an economic crisis paved the way for the boom of the post-war period. This time, though, not in the guise of a finance-based normalcy, but a more visible and escalating class war. We're thus talking about crisis, rebellions, and most likely wars. This is the conjunction. In 2018, it briefly looked as if the crash would delegitimize the neoliberal financial model at the government level. But that did not really occur. It occurred somewhat later. 2016 with Brexit and Trump. Initially, instead, governments all over the world passed a bill onto their populations in the form of massive austerity programs that were supposed to demonstrate the ability of the states to pay back their debt. The project, which only became all the more implausible as the austerity programs and cuts undermined demand